Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our first quarterly Therap QA session. We're happy that you're here. Thank you very much for coming. We will record this because we know that it is a beautiful Friday afternoon at the beginning of summer and people have other things to do, but we will make that available after we do this. So this is our first foray in a long time into doing a quarterly QA user group. We're going to push out some polls later to ask for your feedback, to find out if this works for you, if there's certain topics, those kinds of things that we'd like to talk about. So again, we'll do this quarterly. We're kind of hoping to do some sort of presentation about Therap and QA for the first half of the meeting, and then the second half doing more about information and asking questions and getting feedback from everybody. So this is really going to be based on your feedback and what your interests are and what you need from across the country in terms of quality assurance. So thank you for coming today to the first one. My name is Karen Niedermeyer, and I'm the business development consultant, and I live in Albany, New York, and so I'm in the Northeast. And prior to working for Therap, I actually worked in QA for about 15 years in an ARC in New York State. So I'm very happy to get to do this and kind of talk about this as one of my favorite topics. So today we're going to talk about just writing a Therap QA manual. And what that really means is we're going to talk about the things that you have to do in Therap for quality assurance and for auditing. And one of the reasons I like to bring this up is because when people start Therap, sometimes they think that there's actually less they have to do for quality assurance because there's so many kind of quality control checks already in place. And what kind of happens the longer you're in it is you realize that there's actually more things that you need to do because there's more information that you're learning through having an electronic health record that you didn't necessarily know prior. So that's kind of what we're talking about today. And then we'll kind of answer any questions that you type in or raise your hand if you have anything that you want to add or questions you want to ask. Again, we'll have two polls for you, and also under handouts, you can see a copy of this kind of little PowerPoint. It's short, so it won't give you too much, but it will at least give you something. So, okay, with that, we're going to get started. So before we start talking about a quality assurance plan in general, I kind of like to talk about just the rules of kind of writing a plan and writing quality controls, and that just acknowledging that everything is objective and free from undue influence. That means it really needs to be independent. And in terms of Therap, one of the things to remember is that if you're the provider admin of Therap, then you can't really be the person who's being objective and free from undue influence in auditing Therap. So really making sure that you have somebody else who's auditing you. If you are the provider admin and you're in quality, you really can't be doing both things, which is hard because as the provider admin, you probably know more about it than everybody else does, but you still need to kind of pull that apart. Appropriately positioned and adequately resourced. And when we talk about resources, what I really mean is really people. Is making sure that whatever you write in a plan that you can actually do. A couple other ones, and we won't go through all of them, but again, communicates effectively, risk-based assurance, is insightful, proactive, and future-focused, and promotes organizational improvement. So you want to keep a lot of these things in mind. These are all on Internal Auditor Association kind of feedback about a QA plan. But I just like to go there because I can. So the main kind of pieces when you're talking about writing a QA manual is you really just have to ask yourself questions. And if you are an auditor at heart, like some of us, you already should be asking your question is that in the background, most QA people are just thinking about all the things that people are doing wrong. And while, you don't want to tell people that, and you're certainly not going to go in front of your staff and say, I know all of these things and I know that you're trying to do everything wrong. But that's kind of your job, is to think of all of the evil ways in which they can make changes and do things and figure that out so that you can make sure that people are doing it. You certainly can be positive about it and optimistic and say that most of the time they're doing those things wrong because they probably made a mistake, or they clicked on something they shouldn't have, or it was perfectly just an issue of training or something. But you still have to be thinking of those things. So these are the questions you want to ask. You want to think about, what are your staff doing? When things are on paper, you just assumed that things were happening and where they were happening and what time they were happening. You assumed all of those things because it's on paper. But now with Therap, you are able to see all of those things, so that you need to now be aware that those can be used in a federal audit or a state audit, depending on where you are, and know that you really have to have kind of a tight rope on what can be done. So one of the questions you want to ask are, where are they logging in? So the IP address is on there. If you have a static IP address, it's obviously easier to check. If you do not have static IP addresses, they move around, but you can still look at what IP addresses are showing up most often and do searches on that. So, and my disclaimer before we get into this too much is that we're not going to spend a lot of time in Excel today. This is really just writing your manual and thinking about how this has to be done. The actual doing of these things, we can certainly assist you with our implementation and training specialists, or one of the business consultants can certainly in your area help you kind of go through and figure out how to look at some of this information through Excel that you export out of Therap. So we'll get back to this, sorry. So where they're logging in. You want to make sure that you know where staff are coming from. If somebody is obviously at the Dunkin' Donuts and it's a day program that doesn't leave the room, then that's a problem. Or if a staff member does not allowed to use a computer that's not yours, that's a problem and they're somewhere else. So just knowing where people are is important, and being consistent, so that if you have something that says staff must be at this residence, or staff must do their documentation at a certain location, you have that ability to see where it's done, so you need to be checking on that. Another piece of that is, what time is it? What time are your staff doing their work? And with that time is something that's important for Department of Labor, because if Department of Labor says that if they're an hourly employee, then when they're in Therap, they're working, excuse me, and they need to be paid. So you need to be aware of what time it is that those staff are working. If they're an hourly employee and they work during the day, but every night at 7 o'clock is when they're putting their notes in, then they need to be paid for that time. But the real answer is probably they need to stop logging in at 7 o'clock at night. So while sometimes it's a training issue and you need to talk about, giving them more time in the afternoon, or teaching them a simpler way to do their documentation, or tell them to stop reading every T-log about everybody, or whatever you need to do, you still have to make sure that that time that they're working is during work time and time they're in Therap. So that kind of helps you in that way. Another question you might ask is, what device are they using? Usually when you log in activity tracking at login, it will show you which type of device they're on. And that can be useful if you're an agency that decides that you're not a bring your own device agency. They have to be using devices that they're given. If you are seeing a lot of mobile IDs, or phones or tablets or things like that, you want to make sure that those are purchased and done by your agency, and those are not are not their own devices. Now, if you do have a bring your own device policy, then obviously that's a different scenario. But that's something that you would want to look at, is what kind of device they are using. Something else you might consider about what your staff are doing, and what programs are they in, and what modules are they in. We give a lot of people access during different times to different things. If there's an emergency, you might add something. They might have a secondary profile for subbing or on call, or so you might have all of those things in place. But you do occasionally want to do some sort of check to just see how often are they looking into those other programs and whether or not they should be or not. Most of the time, people are just curious. They want to know what's going on, and they like to be informed, even though they don't need to be. Sometimes people just click around because they like to click around, and frankly, they're so used to being on the computer that it's just, we might as well look at everything. I don't like to believe that people are doing malicious things, but you have to be aware that even though it's not a HIPAA issue, which I want to make sure everybody understands, it's not a HIPAA issue. If you work for the organization and you see information within the organization, it's not something that you would write up and send in for HIPAA. But there's a certain amount of understanding that you don't want to give people access to things that they shouldn't be seeing. So if they subbed at a house 2 years ago, why are they looking at it today? So that kind of thing is something you want to be aware of. An obvious one is just what actions are they taking? Why are they updating health information? Why are they, why do they go in and do follow-up to all those T-logs? Why are they always in appointments and doing certain actions? Why are they never logging out? Why, that's an easy one. Why am I pulling up a list and everybody's just, their sessions are always expiring, things like that. It's just some stuff you can check out about what your staff are doing. And then the last thing on this slide is just, what procedures have you put in place that can be bypassed or ignored? And that's a really weird thing to ask, but think about it this way. So you don't want your staff to delete ISP data. They know for sure they're not allowed to delete ISP data. Well, we know that in the super role that ISP data and ISP programs discontinue is the same role. So you need a bunch of staff to be able to discontinue those ISP programs, but they're not allowed to do ISP data. Well, you have given them that. You have able to do that, so you need to check on that to make sure that nobody's deleting anything they shouldn't be deleting. So if you put procedures in place to tell them that they shouldn't be here, or yes, you can see this, but you shouldn't be commenting, or any of those types of questions, you have to have something in place to check on that at a later date. You can't just assume, well, I told them not to do that, so they shouldn't really be doing that. So those are just some things that you really need to think about on what your staff are doing. Okay, so this is something that's kind of the next level to that, and it's who's watching. So who's watching these things? Who's making sure that all of those things that we just talked about aren't happening on a regular basis? Now, most of the time when you start Therap, your QA plan for your agency has nothing to do with electronic health records. And even a couple years in, a lot of times people aren't really thinking about these kinds of things. They're thinking about just getting things up and running, and their QA and their auditing is still just about all those papers. But you really have to start thinking about, now you have to train those auditors and those QA staff to watch these things. Not only do they still have to audit the things that they used to audit, they still have to make sure documentation is completed and goals are reached, and people are putting times and things, and the MAR is done appropriately. But they have to watch all these other things we just talked about. The next thing is, who's watching the watchers? Which sounds like such a silly thing, but you really want to know who is watching the people who are watching everybody else. And I know that kind of throws kind of another loop into it, but if I'm the one at my agency who's doing all of this, who's making sure that I'm doing everything I should be? but also who's making sure I'm not deleting things, or if I am, I have backup to delete things, or if I'm discontinuing things, who's checking to make sure I've been given the reasons to do that. So, something to keep in mind is when you have people delete or discontinue things or stop things, it used to be we always said nothing happens unless it happens in writing, and it's still really the case. So is there an email or an SCOM to back up why that change was made? Why did you delete a week's worth of data or information from somebody? Where'd you get that from? The person who has the provider admin who has the most experience and has the most ability in Therap is the person you have to pay attention to as well, because they really are able to do so much. You want to make sure that they are doing things based on the procedures and policies that you put in place. How are you choosing your sample? I could spend hours on samples and what that means, but I promise we won't do that. But how are you choosing your sample? Are you actually running a sample size monthly? Are you, looking at everything? You cannot look at every single thing every day. That's part of auditing in general. You have to look at everything at least once, I would think, but you cannot, depending on the size of your agency, that should probably be the thought about that though too. So if you have a very small agency, you certainly can. But if you're dealing with large numbers, if you're dealing with an agency who serves 2,000 people, you certainly can't look at all of these things for everybody. So how are you choosing your sample? Is it a fair kind of way to choose a sample? You can't obviously do a completely random sample. There's really no such thing unless you're using a generator of some sort, which we won't get into, but making sure you're choosing a sample, and not just because you've heard rumors about this or done this, but making sure in your procedures you've decided how you're going to do that. What programs are you looking at? Are you making sure you're looking at all of these programs and what they're doing, and what programs? Are you only looking at community programs? Did you forget about residential? Did you look at clinical services? Are you looking at provider and super roles and provider admins and all those other things? And then the last thing about who's watching is how are you keeping track of what you are looking at? You really need to make sure that you have something in your plan that shows, where you've been and where you're going, if that makes sense. So there's a lot of different ways to make a QA plan. There are certainly, this is just kind of a chart-like kind of a QA plan. You can certainly use just words and write it out. I'm a big fan of either some sort of chart or bullets or something, because you want to make it as simple as possible. But you really want to talk about what are the certain things you're doing. You can say monthly I do site audits. And in those site audits, I pick 5 sites a month, and I go through all of them with certain things. Or I do a staff audit monthly where I go through the staff at so many different programs. Or an action audit monthly, which means I'm looking at, logins and IP addresses and what are the actions people have taken. Location audit maybe you do that quarterly. Maybe you go through all the shared contacts annually, because I don't know who wants to do that more than annually. But just all the things that you have to do, and then providing some sort of detail about what that means. So what kinds of things are you doing on that other side? And how is that being done? Because you should be able to look at that and know, what's happening. Obviously, you're not going to put in the details. How do you pull out and export the certain search and you do this and that? But you need to have other people understand what you're doing. So again, what's in your audit? Some things that we just talked about before, and I have another list after this. IP address, times, devices, programs, talking about expired sessions, things that are deleted, passwords. And again, a lot of this stuff is about training and people understanding what they're doing. Sometimes a person who's always having issues with their password and having expired sessions just needs a little more computer training or understanding about hitting enter versus selecting submit, or, depending on the area of Therap you're in. So just making sure that people have the education and training that they need to do their job. But sometimes there's more, and that's your job, is to make sure that that information is safe, and that you are doing the best you can procedurally to make sure that people are aware of their job. So procedural audits, you want to see, this is the order of things you have to do. If something's deleted, if I need to delete something as an admin, I have to have some sort of backup to show that. It has to be attached to the deleted thing, so you need to be looking for that stuff. Timeliness of entering data. In New York, we call that contemporaneous, which is a made-up word. It's a real word, but it's not used too often. It's just, what time are they putting in that data? Are they entering everything a month later? And do they really remember what they're entering, if that's what it is? If your procedure or policy says that they shouldn't be entering things any more than a week later or 3 days later after the day, then you need to stick by that. So all this audits and this QA manual really is based on what the rules are for your agency, and the most important thing is to be consistent when looking at those. So I did something similar to this at the national conference, and we had a lot of people who had different ideas about some different kinds of audits we could do, and different kind of reviews. So they're not necessarily audits, but just quality assurance pieces to kind of clean up what's happening at your agency. So here's some of the things that we kind of came up with as a group. So looking at the MAR, and if everybody's doing things in quick mode versus detailed mode and what they're putting in. Maybe looking at ISP program templates. So somebody should probably be going through your internal template library and deleting things that are old, making sure people aren't using things that they shouldn't be using, those kinds of things. So that's a good one to look at. Auditing the admin, doing an admin audit, looking at preferences and things under the admin tab, to make sure that people are, nothing's been changed and that shouldn't have been, or that whatever is in there, more importantly, whatever is in there is what you say your procedures say. So if your procedural says that passwords will be a certain length, you probably should make sure that those passwords have those rules in effect. Some of the bigger ones would be user privileges, caseloads, and super roles. That's a lot of work and will take some time, but making sure this stuff is clean helps so much in terms of when you're being audited by outsiders, but also internally just understanding your own structure. If you have 27 employees and 27 different super roles, that works fine until you add more people and it gets bigger and you need to add programs. Just making sure that your caseloads are clean, that your user privileges are pretty clean about who has what, and understanding all of those things. Somebody suggested if you're using the BER, checking on those interventions and behaviors pretty regularly. Knowing that if you're using the BER, people can add their own exciting interventions that they feel that they can do, or their own behaviors onto a BER, and just making sure, cleaning that up and making sure people aren't doing what they shouldn't be doing, or teaching people things they shouldn't be knowing. Looking at GER types, the length of time GERs go to completion. And what we mean by GER types is really just taking a quick look at your incidents or your events throughout the year and making sure people are categorizing things correctly and not using the wrong types. That'll go a long way for your data. User permissions, this about non-staff as well. I'm sure, or I would hope that if you have people in your system who are using it that are not staff, they could be guardians, they could be families, they could be doctor's offices, that you have some sort of permission that you've given them, and that you have maybe collected some sort of policy or like an electronic, usage statement, and making sure that those are on site and you have all of those. Collection date versus service date, we talked about that a little bit before. making sure that, they're actually collecting data versus when they're doing it. Templates and time tracking. So you have all these templates and who they're assigned to, and just when people are done using them, making sure they're no longer assigned to somebody and you don't need them for that person. Those kinds of things are important to kind of keep track of. Attendance, what's completed, length of time, what's blank, what's just been left there, those kinds of things. Looking at your deleted, deceased, or inactive individuals. Something just to note for those who don't know is that most of your annual contract invoices are based on the number of active individuals enrolled. So kind of keeping that cleaned up and making people inactive when they're no longer part of your organization, and marking them deceased if they're deceased. Those kinds of things are important to kind of keep up. And then looking at inactive and deleted staff, making sure your staff's all cleaned up. So I know that's a lot, and I just gave you so much to do that you probably didn't need to do or didn't want to do. But it's just some ideas on some things that you should be looking at. And the whole idea of this is just to remember that, while there's things that you no longer have to do, and I have some more kind of stuff if we don't have too many questions, there's plenty of more things that you don't have, some things you don't have to do anymore, like match signature sheets to initials and things like that. There are so many things in Therap to kind of keep clean and to make sure people are following procedurally that you have to take care of from a quality assurance standpoint. And so that's kind of where we were going with this. And then kind of my last thing here is just, I talked about, where are you keeping track of all of this? I used to do a QA report that just said the date, what the finding was, what the actions were needed, and then who was responsible. And then the program would have 30 days to send it back and say what actions were taken and what date was that done. So those are just some things that are kind of nice to kind of keep going and kind of think about, you want to make sure that you are keeping track of what you've looked at, who your sample was. You don't want to throw away your sample. You want to keep that somewhere. Just kind of keeping track of all that information and then reporting on it, because it's great that you found these things, but if you don't have buy-in from your staff, any of those kinds of things, if you don't have an administration who's willing to listen to these things and understand the importance of it, then no actions are going to be taken and nothing's going to change. So making sure that there's some sort of reporting mechanism, whether you do a monthly report. I used to do a monthly report, so that to make sure that, this gets sent to administration. Here's the issues we've had. Here's how the actions that are being taken, and here's how they've been resolved, just to show that. And then on an annual basis, you can do some great statistics if you're a friend of stats, which I certainly am, where you can look at how often you had these issues, how often this year at different programs did staff have issues about getting things done on time, how often did, sorry about my phone, how often did people get things done on time? How often did you have people who were logging in when they shouldn't have? And you can pull that out by program and all of those things. So those are all really kind of important things and things you want to look at over time. Hopefully, the longer you use Therap, you'll see kind of a decrease in some of these issues. Sometimes you will see an increase in some of these issues, but those are kind of the main pieces. So that was almost exactly, Sarah, the first half an hour kind of our program today. And what we really wanted to do is just see, we have a few people asking questions, and we're hoping that people will kind of, and I know there's a lot of people on this call, but just kind of let us know either raise your hand and we'll unmute you if you have something to say, or put in questions about things that you are interested in that you would like to do during these QA calls. In the future, will there be webinars on quality and follow through for participants' plan of care? Absolutely, Donna. So we're going to take different views on this, and we're going to have different people. So again, I'm more of a compliance and QA person in terms of the actual doing of services and making sure things are done. But we'll also probably have Jason Laws, who's on, and he will do some stuff on talking about data-driven outcomes and how they can be with a person's plan and looking at goals with the individual. So he will kind of look at that. So there'll be a nice balance between the qualitative and the quantitative, if you will. So I probably am more the quantitative person and will, I'm sure, be back to do different kind of sessions throughout, but we'll try to make them every other or so that we can kind of mix it up between different kinds of quality assurance, for sure. Will there be development of an audit role that does not give access to change everything in Therap, but truly view-only role? That's a hard one. We used to have an audit role that was view-only, but they can still view things, but I do understand that there's some issues with access for some of that. But then you have to, again, watch the watchers, which is another kind of level. Is somebody has to be able to look at that and see what that is. So you really right now have that ability to make some sort of role. So I get that state auditors are asking. So there will be, you can set up an audit role, so all they can see. We used to have one, so that we would call it, internal auditor, and the internal auditor only had view. They had nothing but view, and then after they were done, the provider admin would go in and run their activity report and save it to see what activity they've done, and that's how we dealt with our auditors. That the state auditors, is we would say, look, we run an activity report after every time the auditor is done in there. We run their activity tracking to see where they've been and what they've done, and we're looking for anything that was done that's not audit worthy. The hard part about that is if you have a smaller agency, you don't probably have the ability to have somebody whose only job is to do that. So you're going to have to make them different profiles or different abilities. Because how do you do that in a small agency? You obviously are going to have to work on that in your own policy and procedures. So the handout is already, you can see it on your kind of thing. I actually attached it, just the QA manual handout. I'm not really sure when it will be posted, but we will save it and have somebody post it as soon as we are able to.
The PowerPoint gets sent out just automatically with the follow-up email since we have a handout.
Thank you, Sarah. Sarah, do you have any other things that you would like to add to this so far?
Yeah, well, so I do want to circle back on some of these questions. So, because the topic of, making sure that if an individual is deceased, that they're marked as deceased came up, somebody was asking, do you still have access to that data? And so I want to make sure that everybody understands, absolutely, if you've discharged somebody or marked somebody as deceased, you continue to have access to those records, and can continue to pull those up. You would need to have caseload access to that individual still. This is a big thing. So, so that was one of the questions that came up. Let's see, I think we've addressed most of the questions in here. And we will be posting the recording of this call. We're gonna actually cut it off kind of after the presentation part. So we won't post this kind of discussion portion that we're having at the end. But the recording of Karen's presentation will be available later. So, I guess at this point, if people don't have additional questions about the presentation, we can kind of move into, more so our discussion portion of the call.